The truth is, in 1776, United States didn't mean what it means today. There's this massive gap in our history that we usually gloss over. We all know George Washington was the first president, right? But his presidency didn't start until 1789. That is 13 years after we declared independence. That 13-year gap is what I want to talk about today. Because even though I learned about this in school with a bunch of boring dates I immediately forgot, this little gap helps answer almost every question I have about our current government. It explains why tiny Rhode Island gets the same number of senators as huge California, and why we don't actually vote for our president directly. This gap is United States 1.0. It all comes back to that tiny lowercase u. In American schools, we learn about the 13 colonies as if they were a unified team. But back then, no one called them that. They were 13 totally separate, individual colonies. Yes, they were all British, but they were independent of each other. Some were run by corporations, some by rich families, and some directly by the crown. They were like 13 different countries that just happened to share a neighborhood. That is, until Britain needed money. The British had been fighting the French in a series of global wars and had racked up a massive debt. To pay it off, they started enforcing taxes on the colonies: the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act. I used to think these were oppressive, 90% income taxes. It turns out they weren't actually that high. They were more like a modern sales tax. The problem wasn't the amount, it was the precedent. The colonists thought, what's going to stop an out-of-touch parliament 3,000 miles away from hiking these taxes forever if we have no say in it? This collective fear, taxation without representation, is what forced the colonies to finally talk to each other. They started boycotting tea, protesting in the streets, and eventually, a 33-year-old political theory nerd named Thomas Jefferson spent 2 weeks in a Philly boarding house writing the manifesto that would change everything. When the United States broke away, that lowercase u was a description, not a name. They were 13 independent states who were united in the specific act of leaving Britain. The document says they were free and independent states. In the 18th century, state meant a sovereign entity, like France or Spain. They created a rule book for themselves called the Articles of Confederation, and the language they used was incredibly telling. They didn't call themselves a nation. They called themselves a firm league of friendship. Think about that. This revolution was about throwing off a big, powerful, centralized government. They weren't about to recreate one. They wanted government to be as fractured, local, and weak as possible. So, they fought a war to make this independence real. And it wasn't just Americans versus the British. It was a civil war. Many people here wanted to stay British, and it was a global war. France, Spain, and the Dutch jumped in because they loved watching the British Empire get taken down a notch. When the British finally signed the peace treaty in 1783, they didn't acknowledge the United States of America as one country. They listed them one by one: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and so on. They were 13 sovereign winners. By 1783, the states had exactly what they wanted: independence. They disbanded the army and went home to do things their own way. But the 1780s turned out to be a total disaster. Because there was no strong central power, the League of Friendship was falling apart. States were having border disputes. They were printing their own different currencies. New York was putting tariffs on goods coming from Connecticut. Maryland and Virginia were fighting over who got to navigate the Potomac River. The Congress, that little baby central government, had no power to fix any of it. They couldn't enforce laws, and they couldn't collect taxes. They had to beg the states for money, and the states just said no. It was like the UN or NATO today, an alliance that can't actually force you to do anything. Meanwhile, the British military just refused to leave. They kept forts in American territory because they knew the Americans didn't have a unified army to kick them out. Pirates were capturing American ships because there was no navy to protect them. George Washington was sitting at his house in Virginia, watching the experiment crumble. He was embarrassed. He wrote to his friends calling the country the Disunited States. He said we were becoming a laughingstock in the eyes of Europe. This is where James Madison comes back into the story. He had been studying every democracy in history, trying to figure out how to do this right. He realized a revision of the old system wouldn't work. He convinced George Washington to come out of retirement to attend a convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Washington was the guest of honor. His presence gave the meeting legitimacy. If Washington was there, people felt safe that they weren't just building a new tyranny. In that hot, sweaty room in Philly, Madison and the delegates spent 3 months debating. They realized 3 major lessons from the failure of version 1.0. First, a weak central government is a disaster. They needed a national government that could actually tax, raise an army, and regulate trade. Second, you can't concentrate all that power in one place. They leaned on the French philosopher Montesquieu and split the power into 3 branches: legislative, to write laws; executive, to enforce them; and judicial, to settle disputes. Third, they were terrified of mob rule. These were elite landowners who didn't trust the unruly passions of the masses. They wanted to limit how much direct impact the people could have. This brings us to the Constitution. This is the document that solved United States 1.0. To prevent any one group from getting too much power, they split the Congress into 2. One side, the House, was for the people, elected every 2 years. The other side, the Senate, was for the states, 2 senators per state, no matter how many people lived there. This was a compromise to keep tiny states from being bullied by big ones. They created an executive, the president, to make fast decisions during crises, but they made sure he wasn't a king. He can't spend money unless Congress gives it to him. And they created the Electoral College, a convoluted system to ensure the president wasn't just picked by a simple popular vote of the passionate masses. Everything in our modern government that feels broken or weird is actually a remnant of the 1787 patch to a failing system. The system was designed to be slow. It was designed to force compromise. It was designed to keep those 13 independent states from killing each other while still functioning as one united entity. We finally got our capital U, but the tension between the states and the central government never really went away. It's baked into the code.